Gretel Anspach. Welcome very much. Thank you very much for coming. And the floor is yours.
Oh, what I'm going to say. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here tonight. Some
You're
of
welcome.
what I'm going to say is stuff you folks already know, but it's kind of worth repeating just to make sure we're all on the same page. So plants have life cycles: annuals, tender perennials, biannuals, and perennials. How you grow them depends a little bit on the life cycle. So annuals, guaranteed you can grow from seed. They may not breed true, but you can do it. You can also grow them from cuttings. Annuals are, when we're talking to people new to gardening, we say annuals live a year and then they die. What really happens is that annuals live one reproduction cycle. And if you stop them from having that reproduction cycle, they'll probably live 18 months, but they aren't going to live past one reproduction cycle. So if you take a cutting of a 6-month-old annual, you may get it to live another year. There's no timer clicking on it, but it's one reproduction cycle. Perennials, whether they're tender or other or hardy, are going to live multiple reproduction cycles unless something kills them first. Some can be grown from seed, some are sterile, and then there's cuttings and division. Biannuals also live one reproductive cycle, but it doesn't happen the first year. And seeds and cuttings work for them. The types of propagation are sexual and asexual. Asexual propagation is supplemented with grafting and budding, which I'll mention but not talk about a lot. And then there's micropropagation. So micropropagation is something that requires such a level of cleanliness that most people can't do it at home. So I'm not really going to be talking about that either.
Mhm.
Sexual propagation is a mix between two sexually compatible individuals. And when that happens, you get a brand new plant that was never there before. If you are breeding open cultivated cultivars, then the next generation is going to resemble the prior generation a lot, but it won't be identical. What happens is you will always see some variety, and in that variety, we find new forms, new hardiness, new disease resistance. The problem is it's slow and random. You really don't know what you're going to get. Asexual propagation, you are cloning and you get an exact duplicate with all of the strengths and weaknesses retained. If you can pull it off, it's generally faster. What they've found with apple trees, for example, is that over decades, the the clone weakens as if you're doing grafting and budding. But if you do a full up clone into the ground, then it seems as if it retains all its original stuff, characteristics. What you have in a flower is the advertisement around the outside if the plant is pollinated by a critter, and in the middle are the sexual bits. Male first, then female. The male bits are called stamens, at the tip of which are anthers, which contain pollen, which is the male gamete, half of the genetic code of the plant, which we have dubbed male because that's the way we think. In the middle is the pistil, which we dub the female part, at the base of which is the ovary with the ovules, which are the female gamete, half the genetic code, and we dub it female because that's the way we think. When a plant gets pollinated, what it requires is for a compatible piece of pollen to land on the top tip of the pistil called the stigma. It's a sticky pad. The pollen germinates, sends a pollen tube down the style. It enters one of the chambers containing ovules, penetrates the ovule, and now you have a seed, which still needs to ripen in order to become viable. Once the whole thing ripens off, if you look at the picture of the apple, The ovules become the seeds, the ovary becomes the core, and then there's an extra bit of tissue at the base holding it all together called the hypanthium, and that becomes the part of the apple that we really enjoy eating. So we have selected apples for giant hypanthia. And sometime when you're in the store and you want to show off, you can say, my, that's a marvelous hypanthium, don't you think? The issue is, or not the issue, but the thing to note is that whole fruit is entirely the female a contribution of the same flower that had the ovary. None of it is the male part except for the seeds, and they are a mix of both of them. So what confuses a lot of novices is in the garden, you will pick a squash, and the squash is all mom, therefore guaranteed it's predictable. But if you save the seeds to the next year, you get a mix of mom and dad, and you have no idea what that's going to turn into. The seed is an amazing piece of work. Inside it is everything it takes to turn into a plant, a beginning of a stem, a leaf, and a root, and then this package called the cotyledon, which both acts as nourishment for the plant while it's in the seed and the energy to do initial growth and becoming the seed leaf. All of that is wrapped up in the seed coat, which is there to stop the seed from germinating until conditions are just right. And that could be 1,000 years later. There's some seeds that we have generated that are over 1,000 years old. And it's just amazing. And others, it just goes away right at the beginning. Once the dormancy, I'll call it, of the seed breaks down, the first thing that happens is the seed breaks open and the root comes out, and it heads straight down because it's generating hormones, and the hormones know which way down is. So they go straight down. The root extends and pushes the seed up through the surface of the ground where it splits open, and out comes that cotyledon, that seed leaf, which doesn't tend to look anything like the adult leaves. With dicots, it tends to be an oval. With monocots, it tends to look like a piece of grass. At this point, the plant can photosynthesize. And when it can photosynthesize, it can generate new energy packets. So it's no longer relying on what was stored in the seed. In steps 2 through, I'll say 4.5, the plant is incredibly vulnerable because it's operating entirely on stored energy. It's importing water, it's importing dissolved nutrients, but the energy to do something with them, to build new cells, is all stored. It can't generate new ones until it starts photosynthesizing. So that's when it's really vulnerable. And if you're starting seeds, that's when you need to make sure you don't stop it growing. You don't let it completely dry out. Once it gets to step 5, it's generating new energy packets, and it's using some of them to grow, and it's using others to rebuild its energy stores. So once you get into steps 5 and 6, if the plant dries out, it very well may recover, but not before then. If you want to start seeds, how much it's going to cost you depends on how many you start. If you just start one, it ends up being quite an expensive proposition because you need a whole bag of seeds and you need a whole pack of, I'm sorry, you need a whole bag of soil, you need a whole pack of tomato seeds or whatever you're starting. By the time you get up to starting a fair number of seeds, it ends up being cheaper than what you could buy them at. You can work the economy by sharing seeds among your friends. So you don't need all the 35 to 40 seeds in that tomato pack. You buy the tomatoes, somebody else buy the peppers, and you'll work it and you'll save some money. The required equipment to start seeds is what I keep calling dirt and shouldn't. It's soilless mix or seed starting mix or potting soil. Any of those will do very nicely. What they have in common is that they are light and fluffy and that they don't have any weed seeds. They don't have any fungus. They are making a very benign, non-competitive environment for seeds to start in. The primary ingredient in any of those is peat moss or coir, which is a coconut fiber. And while we don't like that, since neither of those is particularly nice for the environment, we haven't found a good substitute. So where 50 years ago we would tell people to use peat moss everywhere, this is by now just about the only place we're telling people to use peat moss. This and stratification, which I'll mention later. Don't use garden soil. Don't try to start your seeds inside in garden soil. They're going to have so much competition from weed seeds, from fungus, from jumping worm eggs that you inadvertently bring inside. It's just easier to start with potting soil or seed starting mix. Unless you're planting very delicate, tiny little seeds, it doesn't matter which you use. It'll all work out. You will need something like a pot. It needs to be able to hold soil and it needs to be able to drain water. I tend to select pots that are 3 to 4 inches tall or less. That's because the easiest way to water your seedlings is by putting them in a watering tray and having them wick the moisture up. And there's a limit to the height that soil can wick moisture. It's not going to wick it up 2 feet. So a fairly shallow pot is what you're looking for. Beyond that, it could be just about anything. You can use an egg carton as long as you drill holes in the bottom. I want to point out the Jiffy 7 pot, which is in the top left of the screen, only because I'm going to be mentioning it again later. When you purchase it, it looks like a flat disc, light brown. It is 100% peat. There's another kind that's 100% coir. And the thing I like it is shelf stable. It can last forever. And you know, looking at it, that you can't plant anything in the way it is now. So you don't tend to misuse it. When time comes to start the seed, you chuck that disc into hot water and it poofs out into that sort of dumpling that you see on the right of the picture. It has an upside and a down. The little flat disc is shown with its upside up. It's all surrounded by a very thin plastic mesh, which doesn't exist in the very top, so it's easier to plant a seed there. You will probably need fertilizer. I've spoken with a number of people whose seedlings got to a certain point and then stopped. And that's pretty much when they ran out of the energy in the seed. The potting soil doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of mobile fertility in it. Even if it has compost mixed in, if that compost is dead, which a lot of bagged compost probably is, the plants don't have a way of accessing those nutrients. You can get potting soil that has fertilizer in it. It will say on the bag how long that fertilizer lasts. But once you get past that period, you will need to fertilize in order to keep the plants growing. I like using any kind of liquid fertilizer that's relatively balanced, that's not specifically designed for a cactus or an orchid or whatever. The kind I use is Neptune's Harvest fish emulsion, which doesn't smell nearly as bad as you'd think it would. But honestly, the only reason I use that is because I like the label, and that's not a very scientific reason. You are going to need labels. Well, I need labels because I'm a retired engineer and I need to know what I'm growing. I hate it when at the end of a growing season, somebody tells me that they grew the most amazing, I don't care, zinnias, and they were beautiful, and all the bees came to them, and they were perfect colors, and they were disease free. And I say, great, what kind were they? And they say, I don't know. That's useless. I want to know what I'm growing. So write a label, and the time to write the label is before you plant the seeds. Because right after you plant the seeds, something is going to interrupt you and you aren't going to get back to writing the label. The watering tray makes watering so much easier. A lot of the time I plant either in those little jiffy pots or in cells, and you can fit 72 little ones in that tray. Dribbling just the right amount of water into each cell gets old really fast. It's so much easier to pour an inch of water into the tray with and have the cells in that tray. Wait 10 minutes, see if there's any water left. If there's no water left, add another inch of water. Eventually, when you come back, there will be water left, and then you pour it off. Now you know that all of the seeds, all of the cells in the tray have gotten as much water as they can absorb. Yeah, the roots were underwater for a little while, but not for very long. It's just so much easier that way. You're going to need light. We tend to not estimate very well how much light plants need, but they need a lot of it. You can grow a handful of plants in a south-facing window right up against the window. But right up against the window, it's colder than it is in the rest of the room. And most seedlings don't like cold. So I recommend using artificial light. I've had a lot of success with 4-foot shop lights using cool white bulbs. They are relatively cheap. You can get each shop light for about $20 if you shop around, and the cool white bulbs last a long time. The light generates some warmth, which the plants appreciate, but it's cool enough that if the plant touches it, the plant doesn't burn. An alternative is to use LEO. Before I do the alternative, you can buy grow bulbs that are fluorescent. However, I wouldn't, because it's done with a coating that breaks down after very little time. So you've spent a great deal more money for a bulb that is no better and may be worse, because once the coating has broken down, who knows what frequencies of light it's putting out. So just plain old cool white. If you're going to grow the plants inside to the point where they have buds, then one cool white and one warm white. If you're just going to be growing them while they have leaves, then 2 cool white is fine. An alternative is LED grow panels, which can be custom built to put out the frequencies of light that plants really, really like. My issue with them is that they are still more expensive per area covered. They also put out a bilious magenta light, which is very hard to live with. If you're growing your seeds in a different room, that's fine. If you're growing them where you live, it's hard to live with. You can, however, find LED grow panels that have a rim of white lights around the edge, which the plants don't care about, but makes it a lot easier for humans to tolerate. So if you're going to go LED, go that way. When you position the lights, you put them directly above the plant, maybe an inch up. It will keep your cats from digging in the soil, but also it will give the plants the light they need. So if this is the top of the plant, this is the bottom of the light. Very little space. The plants need all the light that's coming out of those LEDs. And the further away from the light you are putting the plants, the less light it's getting because the light goes off to the sides. You can see in this setup in the back left corner, those seedlings are really gangly. And that's because they're not getting enough light. There should be another shop light above them. Above every plant, there should be shop light in order for them to get enough light. Since the plants keep growing, you also need a mechanism to accommodate the new plant growth. This is the world's hackiest, cheapest way of doing it, which is just to put 2x4s under the shop lights. And if the plant grows to the point where it's hitting the shop light, you either turn the top 2x4 on edge or you add a new 2x4. You can get a lot more sophisticated than that, but you don't have to. Then there's the optional equipment, and my favorite is a heat mat. These are specially designed for starting seeds. You can pour water on them and they will not short out. They also put out just the right amount of heat to warm the soil about 10 degrees. Most seeds will start a whole lot faster when the soil temperature is around 75 than they will at 60 or 65, which is likely the soil temperature in your, the temperature of wet soil in a 68-degree house. On the flip side, if you don't know whether you're going to enjoy starting seeds, I wouldn't get them yet because it's just one more foolish piece of equipment you have bouncing around your house that you're only going to use for a month or two per year. If you do like growing seeds, it's marvelous. And you can see in that table how much faster the seeds do come up. This is my data. Let me walk you through growing one pepper. Arbitrarily, I have decided to start this pepper in a Jiffy pot. So I look at the seed pack, and the seed pack says, start this 8 to 10 weeks before you're going to plant them outside. And that means that you're going to start it mid-March to beginning of April. Remember that plants don't just care whether there's a frost or not, though that's what the seed pack would let you think. They actually care, is the soil warm and is the air warm? So for the warm weather plants, it's generally good to assume you're going to be planting them outside June 1st, and you can adjust that as you go. But yep, who's ever not muted, please mute yourself.
It's the Federation.
Okay, that's fine.
It's not. I just muted the person that was.
Okay, sounds good. So figure out when to start the seed. Late is better than early. One year I started half my peppers in mid-March, and then I got distracted and I started the other half in mid-April. When I planted them outside in June, the March peppers were a lot bigger than the April peppers. By July, they were all the same size. It will catch up. Late is better than early. So I'm going to grow one pepper. I'm going to arbitrarily grab one of those Jiffy Pot discs. I'm going to hydrate it, make sure it's right side up, scratch it open, put in 2 seeds, not touching each other, shove the dirt over the seeds and squeeze to have good seed soil contact. Then I'm immediately going to put the Jiffy Pot under really bright light because I don't know when that thing is going to come up. And I want to make sure that as soon as it comes up, it has enough light. I'm going to water it. I'm going to put heat under it if I feel like it. I'm going to water it if it needs it, if it starts drying out. Then at some point, it's actually going to come up. Once it's up, I'm going to put the lights on a timer so that they're on 16 to 18 hours per day and off the rest of the time. Plants photosynthesis includes a light cycle and a dark cycle. And with some plants, the dark cycle doesn't require dark, but it doesn't hurt. So a nice cheap timer can click the lights off for 6 to 8 hours a day. I'm going to keep watering it. Once the first true leaves appear, I am going to start fertilizing because I know Jiffy pots have no fertilizer in them. The fertilizer concentration should be adjusted such that you add fertilizer every time you water. And you do that partly because it's a little baby plant and lots of little meals are better. And you're going to do that in part so you don't have to remember when did you last fertilize. An example of that adjustment is if the label says 2 to 3 teaspoons per gallon every other watering, then put in 1 to 1.5 teaspoons per gallon every time. So you're putting in no more fertilizer than they said. You're just spreading it out so it is in every watering. Here's the tough part. If you only plant one seed, by Murphy's Law, it is not going to come up. If you plant 2 seeds, by Murphy's Law, they will both come up. You only wanted one plant. You can dig at the roots and separate them, but then you are setting them both back a little bit. So if you were a pro, you would actually cut that second plant off right at the soil. That's hard. An alternative to beat Murphy is to start 2 Jiffy pots, each with 1 seed in them. And if they both come up, you can always give the other pepper plants away. But you can't let them grow together because they're going to crowd each other. When the roots grow through the side of the pot, it needs more soil space. So you get a bigger pot, you put some soil at the bottom of it, you strip that plastic mesh off the Jiffy pot, put the root ball in the pot, fill in soil all around it, and now for the first time you water from above to make sure that there are no soil voids, places where there was a pocket of air and not enough soil. Water till the water runs out the bottom. If you put the plant in a slightly larger pot, you may need to repot it again. You may not. If you put it in a much larger pot because you're tired of repotting, you can do that. The thing you need to watch is how you water or how you tell when the plant needs water. The root ball is only the size of your fist or smaller. So if you have a foot large pot and you stick your finger in at the edge of the pot to see if the soil is moist, the soil may be moist there, but dry at the root ball. So when you're testing the soil to see if it's moist enough, you need to do it where you know there are roots, because that's where it matters if it's moist enough. You put it under a bright window, or you put it under a light, you keep fertilizing, you keep watering, you keep growing. About a week before you're planning on putting it outside for real, you need to harden it off. That means exposing it to real sunlight, real temperature oscillations. But you don't want to put it directly in full sun right away or the leaves are going to burn. So what I do is I put the plant on my driveway's apron, which is the north side of the house. It gets 2 to 3 hours of first thing in the morning sun, and then it gets bright shade for the rest of the day. If I walk past it twice a day at least, so I'm going to remember to water it. If it's going to get under 40 degrees, I can drag them inside the garage. If it's going to be pouring rain, I can drag them inside the garage. But otherwise, I leave them outside and I let them get used to life. One thing to do is to remove them from the watering trays. You can put them in mesh trays or just leave them out. But if you leave them in the watering trays, when you try watering with the hose end or when it rains, you're going to have to drain all those watering trays or the plants are going to be sitting in water. Time to plant. You dump the seedling out of the pot. If any of the roots go round and round, you tease them out because the roots aren't going to be able to straighten themselves out once they're in the ground. You need to do it now. Ideally, you plant in moist soil on a cloudy day. In reality, you get them in the ground whenever you can get them in the ground. Ideally, you water the plant in after planting to eliminate air pockets. If we have one of those springs that is soft and mild with a rain every 5 to 7 days, you're done. You don't even need to water it. Or if the rain doesn't come, water once a week. If it turns hot and dry and windy, you absolutely need to water, and you probably need to water initially more than once a week. But every time you water, you want to water to make the soil moist where you want the roots to be, not just where they are. So you put down something like an inch of water, which is going to penetrate something like a foot deep into the ground and encourage the roots to go deep. If you end up in that hot, dry, windy period and you're watering every couple of days, you can do that for a week, but then back off to maybe every 3 or 4 days and then back off to once a week. Once the roots are going nice and deep, it isn't going to need constant water, and it's going to be healthier if it has deep roots and gets the water once a week. Suppose you're growing 25 peppers instead. I could put them in individual cells, but again, arbitrarily, I'm going to fill a 4-inch pot with moist seedling mix, scatter the seeds on the surface, making sure they don't touch each other, because it'll make it easier to separate them later, and cover the seeds with the 1/4 inch of seedling mix. This is a really good technique if the seeds are going to have low germination rate, because you'll only end up processing the seeds that processing further the seeds that have actually germinated, rather than having all these empty cells taking up space. Once the seeds are planted, getting them germinated is exactly the same as before. Light and heat and water. Early growth is exactly the same as before, setting the light to being on 16, 18 hours a day and keeping them watered and fertilized once the true leaves appear. At some point or other, the plants are going to crowd each other. When that happens, you need to transplant them. If there are only a few up, you can, and the stems are well separated, you can dig them out of the pot using a popsicle stick or something like that. If there are a lot of them in there and it's crowded, it's easier to dump the root ball sideways onto your hand. So the bottom is on one side and the plants are on the other. And then just start breaking the seed pack apart with your hands. The rules say that you are allowed to manipulate each plant by its roots or by its true leaf, but you are not supposed to grab the stem. And the reason you're not supposed to grab the stem is because it's too easy to pinch it. If you're holding the stem with 2 fingers, and now you should look at me and not the slide. If you're holding the stem like this, it's really easy to pinch it too hard and end up killing the plant. However, it's really hard to manipulate some of the plants by their roots or seed leaves. Again, looking at me, not the slide, if you put 3 fingers together, you can see it forms a little triangle. And that's a great place to grab a stem, because it's in that triangle. You don't feel like you need to squeeze particularly hard in order to grab it. I've never killed a plant that way. So you are also allowed to handle the stem, provided you do it with 3 fingers and not 2. Some of the seedlings are going to come apart with a lovely little clump of soil on them. Some of them are going to come apart with one dangly root and not any soil on it. Don't worry, those will probably make it too. Before you do any of this, you should prepare the pots that these seeds are going into with moist potting soil. Dig a hole with your finger or a something. And then as you separate the seedlings, you lower them root first into the hole to the same depth as they were before. Push the soil closed around the root ball and you're done. Everything after that is the same. Let me tell you a few special cases associated with seed starting. One of them is cold stratification. And the point of this is that northern seeds, seeds that grow above the frost line, like here, some of them have a built-in block that will stop the seed from germinating until it's been cold for a while, or cold and wet. The point of it is if the seed is generated, ripens off in August and falls to the ground, well, the seed is now warm. When it rains, it's wet. Why wouldn't it germinate? Well, if it germinates then, it may not survive the winter. So, chemical block against germinating until it's been through a winter. With some seeds, it requires just cold. With some, it requires cold and wet. Most of our highly bred seeds, we have removed that need. One exception is Cleome. And with Cleome, on some seed packs, it'll still say, we advise cold stratifying your seeds before planting for best success. In that case, that means chucking the seed pack into the fridge for 3 weeks. If you don't, you will probably get 25% germination. If you do, you will probably get 80 or 90% germination. The wildflowers are another issue. And there, if you're going to start wildflower seeds, and it's not a very explanatory seed pack, I would recommend looking online to see if stratification is required, and if so, for how long. Sometimes it's 3 weeks, sometimes it's 3 months. If they require cool, moist stratification, put the seeds mixed with damp sand or peat or a 50-50 blend in a baggie in the fridge for the required amount of time. At the end of that time, the seeds probably won't have germinated, and that's fine. You plant them the same way you would anything else. And if the seeds are too small to separate from the sand or peat, you can just spread the sand peat seed mix on the potting soil and cover it or not. And you'll get much better germination rate. Plan B is to start the seeds in fall and let winter take care of it for you, planting them in milk jugs, planting them directly in the soil or in pots. Just make sure the pot doesn't dry out if we get a warm spell. Soaking or scarring is a good way of increasing the germination rate of the seeds that have a thick seed coat, like morning glories and nasturtiums. You don't have to, again, you will probably get some to germinate anyway. And if you throw nasturtium seeds in the ground and then it rains for a week, you'll get nearly 100% germination. But if you throw them in the ground and then it doesn't rain for 3 weeks, it's possible none of them will come up. So a way of ensuring higher germination rate is to soak them overnight. You will see that that black seed coat breaks open when the inside of it swells, and then you can plant those. With some of those, it doesn't. You can either nick them and soak them again, or just chuck them on the ground and see what happens. For the little seeds where nicking them might result in nicking yourself, you can also put them between 2 sheets of sandpaper and just do that a couple of times. Some seeds require light to germinate, some seeds require dark to germinate, and some seeds don't care. A good seed pack will tell you, but if you are growing seeds that someone gave you, do look it up because it matters. There are two phrases that are almost the same, but mean something very different. One is sow in average soil after danger of frost. That means that it comes fairly quickly from seed to whatever it is you're growing it for. And you don't have to start them inside. You can just plant them outside. The other phrase is sow outdoors where they are to flower, or sow outdoors where they are to grow, if it's something like carrots. And that means that they hate having their roots disturbed. If you transplant carrots, the root's going to fork. Same thing with parsnip, same thing with most of the root crops. You can still do it, particularly if you're growing the plant for greens, but the root is going to fork. With poppies, if you mess with their roots, they're going to sulk big time. They may not flower, they may not grow. You can grow poppies, you can start them inside if you do them like method 1 in that jiffy pot, because you're never really disturbing the roots. If you do it like method 2, where you pull the root ball apart, you will not have success. Things that can go wrong and will are dry seedling mix or potting soil. So it's time to plant your seeds. You find a bag of potting soil. You think it's moist enough. I plant all my seeds in it. I add water to the watering tray and put the cells on top, and everything floats. And it's going to stay floating because very dry peat moss becomes hydrophobic. It sheds water. The fastest way to make peat moss not shed water is to add really hot water to it. But I have seeds in there, and I don't want to do that because I don't know what their sensitivity to hot water is. So the alternative to throwing the seeds out is to get a squirt bottle and fill it with warm but not hot water, put it on mist, and mist the surface of the soil, and it'll get shiny, and then the shine goes away. And you do it again, and you do it again. And the last time I made this mistake, it took about 20 cycles of misting it before the soil would accept water. A better plan would have been to throw a handful of the soil in a bowl before I planted anything, add water, and if the potting soil absorbs the water, I can use it. And if the potting soil doesn't, I can either throw it on the ground outside, or I can throw it in a bucket and add hot water, mix it up, wait till it's dry enough to work, and then use it. If you let the seeds get wet and then let them dry out, they'll probably die. If they've already gotten their true leaves, they will probably live. If you don't give them enough light, they get gangly. That's not a reason to throw them out. They aren't going to win any awards, but it's still a viable plant. You can pinch it off later to make it bushy. You can, if it's something like a tomato that grows roots along its stem, you can plant it deep. If you let it get root bound, it will never be as strong as if you didn't. And the interesting thing is that some plants will not forgive you for this. So if you're growing something like broccoli, if it either really dries out to the point of wilting or it gets root bound, any real delay in growth will result in that flower head that we're growing it for not being a solid mass, but a whole bunch of little masses. It's called buttoning. So better if you can avoid it. Every time I've grown seeds under the clear dome that comes with the seed starting kit, they've died, they've damped off. I have a friend who uses the clear dome until half the seeds are up, and then he removes it. And he says he's had a lot of success that way. It's up to you, but I would be cautious about that clear plastic dome. And you definitely can't use the clear plastic dome if the tray is going to be in sunlight, because it'll turn into soup. Everything under that dome, it's just going to get too hot. Here are a bunch of sources that you can find more information from. I'm going to take a really quick look at the questions because we're about to change subjects. If you're growing lettuce in a raised bed and eating by the time they're 6 to 8 inches, do you really need to thin? You do not. You can, yep. Do winter stratification take care of the scarring soaking on plants like Joe pieweed? It does. It probably does, but I don't know the answer to that. Do you ever moisten your soil mix before adding seeds? I don't. I make that dumb mistake, but I should moisten my soil mix before I add seeds. So back to division and separation. So this is the vegetative propagation. You can use it to create more plants for plant sales and things, to rejuvenate older plants. If they get overgrown to a certain point, they may stop making flowers. And also to control the spread of plants. If you're hacking this grass out of your landscape, you may want to get rid of it all, or you may just want to take some and get rid of it. In a perfect world, you would do this division away from when the plant is most ornamental. So spring and summer bloomers in fall, fall bloomers in summer, but you're not doing that for the plant, you're doing that for yourself. So it's up to you. I tend to like dividing in spring when I see the shoots of the hosta coming up, because that's the easiest time to divide without breaking a lot of leaves. But a lot of the time I don't realize that I need to divide until it's midsummer and the thing isn't doing anything, the plant isn't performing. So you can divide then anyway, provided you understand you're getting rid of a lot of the roots. So when you do that, you need to water. You need to pretend this is a brand new store-bought plant that you have just planted, and you need to water it unless we get rains until the ground freezes. And you probably don't want to do it so late in the year that the roots won't have a time to get established and they might frost heave. There are different root systems that matter somewhat when you're dividing. The spreading, clumping are the most common for plants where we don't actually know what they're doing. We just sort of lump this into their spreading or their clumping, and honestly, I don't know what the difference is. In a perfect world, you are going to water the plant, make sure that the plant is hydrated before you deal with it. Don't dig it up on the hottest day of the year. When you dig it up, shake enough soil off the roots that you can see what's going on, and then separate the plants as gently as you can, which with some plants may be by hand, and with other plants may be with a chainsaw, frankly. You can also just cut a chunk of the plant out of the ground. If somebody comes over and says, gosh, that's a gorgeous daylily, you can just go over there with a garden spade, chunk it into the ground in 3 places, pry out a triangle, and you have propagated, as long as there's at least one growing point coming out of that triangle. So here are the pictures. On the top left is the standard, probably daylily. They have dug it out of the ground and they're now trying to pry it apart with 2 garden forks. And the bottom, they're cutting a hosta bundle apart with a shovel. You do what you can to separate the pieces, making sure that there is at least one growing point in each bundle. There are going to be some where you pull it apart and the growing point breaks off. But if you have enough plant there that you're actually dividing it, don't worry about it. It may come back from the roots, it may not. Stolons are horizontal horizontal stems that generate what they call daughter plants. And the difference between them and other stems is the daughter plant looks like a perfect little adult plant. So it's not just a set of random leaves. It looks like a perfect little adult plant right down to the roots. The two ones that we know best in this category are strawberries and spider plants, the college house plants. So make sure that the roots are in contact with the ground. When they are nicely rooted, you can cut off the connecting stem on both ends. The reason to do that are, number one, you might want to move the daughter plant somewhere. Number two, so that the daughter plant doesn't keep sucking energy out of the mother plant. And number three, because when the ground is covered with these stolons, it's very hard to do anything else like weed. Then there are rhizomes, stem tubers, and tubers. Rhizomes are horizontal stems that grow at the surface or below the surface and send up suckers that turn into flowers or that turn into leaves and things like that. We tend to call dahlias and sweet potatoes tubers. Somebody else might call them a root tuber. And the characteristic there is it's this fleshy thing where the stems come off of one end, the roots come off of the other. The end that the stems come off of is the end where that tuber was attached to the last year's stem. A potato is technically a stem tuber, but everybody just calls it a potato. And it has these germinating eye buds all over it, and not all at one end. And each one of those can turn into a plant. Rhizomes can be leptomorphic or pachymorphic, which literally means thin thing or thick thing. So a pachyderm, also known as an elephant, is a thick skin. I thought that was interesting. Leptomorphs are some of our ground covers. They generate several new shoots in a year, and when you dig them up, you could easily mistake them for just a spreading, clumping root system, except it will go on and on. If you pull one end of Pachysandra out of soft ground, it will just keep coming and coming. Pachymorphs generate one flowering bud at the end of the growing season, and they include things like iris and trillium and clumping bamboo. I'm going to skip this page. It's there for your reading pleasure. No, it isn't. So I'll talk to this page. So again, moist soil, hydrated plants, dig up the plants, separate it into chunks that have at least one growing point in each chunk. Throw out anything that doesn't look good and ideally replant it immediately at the same depth as it was before. So this is an iris, and if you plant this such that soil covers those rhizomes, it won't bloom. It'll grow cheerfully, you'll still get leaves, but it won't bloom. So you got to keep these on the surface. So the plant on the top left was dug up. It now looks like the top right. You can see that central piece is shriveled. So we're going to cut that out and throw it out. We now have two pieces left. The one that's going straight up off the photo is a perfectly viable piece, and we keep that. Then there's this sort of Y shape off to the left. That central, the stem of the Y, does not have a growing point on it. So while you can separate it from the other two pieces, it's not going to send up a shoot. So when you're dividing this, you can separate it and throw it out, or you can leave it attached to either shoot. So you're going to get three cuttings, three divisions out of this iris. This is my spotted trillium. And the marvelous thing about trillium is if they're happy, they pretty much double every year. So this thing pretty much doubled every year. And that's what it looks like. So dig up the trillium, dig it up. Remove the clump from the hole. Get a bunch of the soil off so you can see what you're doing. break it apart. This is when I found out that this thing was rhizomatic. I thought it wasn't, but you can see this fat bare piece where it used to be connected to the hole. So you break it apart and you just keep breaking it apart. You may lose a bit. In the end, each chunk should have at least one stem coming out of it. If you're trying to get two big clumps out of this, you can just break it in half. But if you're trying to get a lot of divisions out of it, you can break it down till each chunk has a single stem coming out of it. And that's what you get when they're all broken apart. You can see all of the broken off rhizomes in there. Then you clip off some of the roots. You're only going to dig the hole so deep. And if there's going to be this tangly pool of roots at the bottom, that's not doing the plant any good. So you make the roots short enough that you can spread them out in the hole, and then you plant them. And this is what it looks like after. All of these made it. The first time you dig up a plant that's dear to you and start hacking at it, it feels very risky. But most of these plants can handle it really very well, so go for it. It's very satisfying. Tubers. Now we're talking about things like dahlias and sweet potatoes. You lift the whole clump out of the ground, brush off the soil, cut away anything that stops your view of it. Also remove any tiny little tubers. Divide it up with pruning shears or a sharp knife, making sure each tuber has an eye, which is the growing bud. Discard anything that looks iffy. The pros divide their tubers in, and this is what this looks like. The pros divide their tubers in fall, because that way they are storing things that look like individual sweet potatoes. It's easier to store them that way. If one of them rots over the winter, it isn't going to take the whole clump with it. And they know what they're doing. A lot of people new to the game divide them in spring, because if you wait till spring, you can see the buds better. They'll start swelling and you can see them. So it's a little easier to do the division. Top left is what the clump looked like when you dug it off and cleaned it off. And then I'm showing various photos of the bud end of the tubers and making sure you have one attached to each tuber. You can slice the old stem right up the middle, and that will make your job a little bit easier. Potatoes, why not? So if you have big potatoes, you cut them up such that each piece has 2 to 4 eyes. You let it sit on the kitchen counter for a couple of days so that the cut surface dries out, and that'll decrease the chances of it rotting. Or if you're a pro, you can dust it with something, fungicide, and then you plant them, cut side down in a trench. There are corms and there are bulbs, and botanically they're very different, but from a propagating standpoint, they're clumps of, they're chunks where each chunk is going to produce a plant, and around the base of them, they're going to produce more cormals or bulbils or whatever, each of which will also cheerfully produce a plant. Lily bulbs often confuse people because we are used to seeing daffodil bulbs that have a skin on them. Lily bulbs are naked. They don't have a skin on them, but that's kind of what's inside a daffodil bulb. You can just see it. What happens with bulbs and corms is if they're happy and they keep dividing, is you will end up with a serious thicket of them. And the ones in the middle may not bloom anymore, but also you may not be able to plant anything else there because it's solid daffodil bulb. So pick them up almost anytime you feel like it and separate them and replant them at the same depth they were before. If they have green foliage on them, you need to leave the green foliage on them because they are photosynthesizing with that green foliage and using it to rebuild the bulb so that you will have a show again next year. So that's the simple vegetative propagation. I have 4 questions. I'll take a quick look at that, and then we're going to talk about cuttings. If you've seen jumping worms in your soil this year, is there anything you can add to the soil to make up for what they've stolen? Compost plus get a soil test. The jumping worms mostly eat dead material. They mostly are going to clean off your mulch and the forest stuff and all of that other stuff. So compost or a really slow release fertilizer. Hardy geraniums are rhizomatic. I couldn't figure out whether they were Pachy or the other one, but you look at the growing stem, you dig the thing up, you look at the growing stems, and you just cut somewhere between them, or if the growing stems are too close together, you break them apart with your hands. Does the central piece of the iris that has the no growing tip provide extra nutrient strength to the smaller tubers that come off of it with growing tips? I would leave it on if it has roots coming out of it. If it doesn't have roots coming out of it, then it's basically done, and it may temporarily provide nutrients, but it's going to shrivel up pretty soon. If it's got roots on it, then yes, it is feeding the rest, and I would leave it on there. Okay, sports. So plants occasionally morph, they mutate randomly. In the bottom picture, this plant decided it was going to be variegated, and the whole plant isn't variegated, just that twig. In the top right, it decided to make pink flowers. And in the top left, what was a dwarf tree decided not to be dwarf anymore. When these sports come up, we decide what we're going to do about it. In the case of the dwarf tree deciding not to be dwarf anymore, you have to remove that vigorous growing tip, or it is going to suck all of the energy out of the plant and kind of make the plant go away. In the other 2 cases, if you want, you can clone just that part of the plant and end up with a variegated whatever or a pink rhododendron. That's what we're going to talk about next. So there are 3 kinds of cuttings: stem, root, and leaf, loosely speaking. To understand what's going on, there are 3 terms: totipotency, differentiation, and dedifferentiation. Totipotency is the ability of a cell to make any other cell. We have that ability when we are shortly after conception, because we start off at 1 cell, and eventually we end up with all of these other different kinds of cells. But all of our cells then lose the ability to be totipotent. If we remained totipotent, we could take a chunk of, I don't know, skin and turn it and grow a new kidney, which would be awesome, but we can't do that. Plants can. When these totipotent cells, called stem cells or cambium, but usually meristems, form other cells, they often differentiate. So the cell then becomes a bark cell, or it becomes vascular tissue, or it becomes cortex, or it becomes something, a leaf. Those cells have the ability to de-differentiate under the right circumstance. So this piece of cortex can go back to being totipotent under the right circumstances and generate roots or whatever it needs to remain a viable plant. And it's that ability that we use to make cuttings. So at the very tip of a stem, is a chunk of this totipotent material, the apical meristem, and it leaves behind it very regular little pockets just like it. They are called buds, and they happen regularly at the junction of a leaf with the stem, but they also can just happen in random places, and then we call them bumps. The apical meristem is doing two big things. One is it's generating all that other tissue, and the other thing is it's sending down hormones that are apical dominants that say, don't grow, I got this. Since plants harvest light to grow, sometimes being tall is really important. So that's why we have apical dominance. Let all my energy go into this one stem, and that stem can go longer than if I'm dividing my energy among a bunch of cells. Roots operate similarly. There is an apical meristem at the base of the root that's generating all of the other piece parts of the root. But the root also, that apical meristem, leaves behind occasional little clots of meristematic tissue at random intervals, and they can remain dormant forever, but they can also wake up. And that's what happens when a root branches, or that's what has happened when a root branches. The tip, if everything is going great, is sending back, I got the signals, but if the tip gets cut off, or it hits nasty ground that's really dry or has low nutrients, it can send back signals that say, okay, you try. Generally, after a plant is cut or wounded, that cut scabs over immediately against drying and diseases. Then, if you actually cut off a piece, the buds in the cut piece generate hormones that make roots and that make shoots. And they can cause the scab to generate roots. And the trick is to make the cutting at the time where that cutting is most likely to survive. We call cuttings softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood. There's also herbaceous cuttings. Softwood cuttings are taken from woody plants when the growth is still green. It's not completely juicy, but it's still green. Semi-hardwood is end of the summer. The new growth has started maturing, turning brown. Hardwood is when the plant is dormant, and then herbaceous cuttings are taken from herbaceous plants. Let me show you one way of making cuttings, in this case from a hydrangea. Hydrangeas largely are done softwood cuttings. You would go out and hack off a nice long branch of hydrangea, or maybe several. You bring it inside and you cut it off. The very tip is called the butterfly. Beyond that, the pieces are called double eye single node, or single eye single node, or whatever. A node is a place on the stem where one or two leaves emerge. One leaf if the plant is growing alternate leaves, two leaves if the plant is growing opposite leaves. Hydrangea grows opposite. At the base of every leaf is a bud, which in this context they call an eye. So that second cutting down is one node, one place where the leaves emerge from the stem, two eyes, two buds. In the third cutting down, they split the stem down the middle. So it's single eye, single node. Then you take a tray that has drainage holes in it. You fill it with sharp sand, playground sand, anything like that. Clean. You wash it. You moisten it so it holds as much water as you can. And you poke a hole in it with a pencil. You take a cutting you dip the root end of the cutting in rooting hormone, you stick it in the hole, and you firm the sand in around it. The reason you don't just use the cutting to make the hole is you don't want to wipe the rooting hormone off the twig. If you're making softwood cuttings or semi-hardwood and the leaves are large, you probably want to cut them in half. The plant has very limited ability to absorb nutrients, to absorb water at this point, and it's going to shed water through its leaves. So that will slow down how fast it loses water. You can put popsicle sticks in the corners of the tray, put the whole thing in a bag, tie the bag closed. What's going to happen then is the bag is going to fog up, and that's good because it means it's nice and humid in there. If the fog on the bag goes away, pull the tray out and re-moisten it. Otherwise, just leave them alone. After 2 to 4 weeks with hydrangeas, pull the tray out of the bag and tug gently on a cutting. If it resists, it has roots. Decide for yourself if it has enough. You can dig one up and see. And if you think it has, 2 or 3 itty bitty roots, but enough, then you pot it up in potting soil and you grow it from there. A hydrangea grown from a cutting that started at the beginning of 2024 will bloom in 2025, or at least it may. So it goes incredibly fast. If any of the cuttings look moldy, pull them out and throw them out. If your cuttings haven't rooted yet, stuff them back in the bag and wait some more. Stem cuttings have polarity. They know which end is up. When we are doing softwood and semi-hardwood cuttings, that's easy because the leaf reminds us which way is up. When we're doing hardwood cuttings, the leaves are off. And you better remember, because if you put the thing in upside down, if it grows roots at all, it'll grow roots off the top. What some of the pros do is on each twig, they set up a system. So they may say, I'm going to cut the bottom at an angle and the top flat. And that way they can cut a whole bunch of twigs and then root them and not worry about getting any of them upside down. If the root zone is 10 degrees warmer than the air, it will root faster. So that's another case where you might think about seed heat mats. Double eye cuttings have higher success than single eye, maybe because you got twice as many hormones. You can also try leaf bud cuttings. If for some reason, like if you have to sneak one of these. Anyway, there's a pathway road to cuttings. And by the way, one not on here, which is still cuttings, is people who have hydrangeas and want more hydrangeas often just take the softwood cutting. They basically prune their hydrangea and then stick the prunings directly into the soil outside, with or without rooting hormone. And a lot of them will take. So you don't have to mess with some plants with the whole sand tray thing. With others, you really do, because they don't come as easily from cuttings. The first 3 pictures of layering, the top row, is very useful for plants that are kind of whippy. And what you can do is you can bend the stem such that it touches the ground, and you can encourage it a little bit by skinning some of the bark off. Wound it so that you're drawing the plant's attention to that point. If it's something like a rhododendron, you can do a simple layer. If it's something like a deutschia or a forsythia, the tip layers work really fine. And you keep it touching the ground for long enough, for a month or 2 or 10, and see if roots form. And if they do, you can sever the branch between the roots and the main plant and then transplant it. I don't know why you would do mound layering. It seems like just bad mulching to me. But if there's a reason for it, you can build up a lot of mulch, a lot of potting soil, a lot of something like that around the base of the plant, way above the root flare. And it is possible that the various stems in the bush will all make roots, and then you can separate them from the main plant and plant them somewhere else. You will probably be kind of killing this plant in the process, but you'll get a bunch of plants out of it, so it may be worthwhile. I've heard of trench layering. I've never run into a plant where you could actually do that. So let's move on to air layering. Air layering is something you would do with plants that aren't whippy, where there's no way you're going to bend something down to touch the ground. What you do is you skin off the bark and you skin off the phloem, which is the outside area that carries sugars around, and then the cambium that generates that. So you're down to real wood, and you cover the area with moist peat moss, bag it up with some kind of a mesh, but you're going to have to keep it moist, and you very well may get roots, in after which you can sever the end. So if you have this long overgrown apple tree or something, and I don't know about an apple tree. Well, anyway, and you're going to cut the branches off anyway, you can try this just for the heck of it and see if you can get them to root before they're cut off. The idea of leaving the wood attached is the wood is what transports water and dissolved nutrients up from the roots. So that part of the branch is going to remain hydrated. See what happens. Then there are root cuttings. If any of you have ever tried to eradicate certain plants from your yard and failed, you are very familiar with root cuttings, but some people actually use them deliberately to make more plants. The process is to make segments of roots that are long enough to have buds on them, because buds are not always visible on roots. And you put them in the right environment and you wait and you see if plants come up. Then there are leaf cuttings. I always used to think that when you took, for example, a jade plant leaf and stuck it in the ground, that the leaf itself rooted, and that's what they meant by saying you got a new plant. It actually generates these tiny little plantlets, and once they're big enough that you can really see them, you can separate them. African violets will do the same, and Rex begonias will generate plantlets along the stems of the leaf. This seems to be, with the exception of sedums, mostly a house plant thing around here. The tools that you will use most, both for dividing and for making cuttings, are those. Bypass pruners, a nice sharp pair of bypass, which means they operate like scissors rather than anvil, which means something crushing, cutting and crushing. A full stroke pruning saw for cutting off larger limbs that you will then make into cuttings, or for actually using in the ground or on a dug up clump of something to cut it apart. If it's even tougher than that, like a big old clump of some kind of grass, consider using a reciprocating saw. And again, you can cut the plant up in the ground, or you can dig the plant up and then cut it with a reciprocating saw. Using a saw in soil will dull the blade relatively quickly, so don't use your prize anything working in the soil. Plan on having a separate pruning saw for soil and for pruning. A garden fork is great for prying plants out of the ground, and a garden spade is great for digging plants out of the ground. A spade and a shovel are not the same tool. A spade is for digging, and it usually has a flat or nearly flat end. It's relatively straight from top to bottom, and it's perfectly suited for digging a hole or cutting something in half. A shovel usually has a pointy end. It has a more arched stem and concave blade, and it's perfect for moving a pile of something from here to there. And you'll probably need both. Here are some marvelous references. The Michael Durr's Reference Manual of Woody Plant Propagation is for pros. It will tell you so much that your head will explode. You may not want to start there. I would start, if you are doing woody plant propagation, with the Debbie Lonnie, Nancy Ross, etc. book, Growing Shrubs and Small Trees in Cold Climates. It's a really good book. They reissue it every once in a while and they shuffle the authors' names around, so don't worry too much about that. But they will tell you which cuttings work for which plants, as well as a bunch of other information about growing woody plants. The Leonard Perry is the equivalent of the Michael Durr book, except this time for herbaceous plants. And then there's a bunch of other stuff. I have 3 more questions. Does the central piece of I did that one. How do I propagate cuttings from a snake plant? I have no idea. I have to say that I don't know beans about snake plants, and that's one of my deficiencies. So what I would do is I would see if you can find, I think the Perry book is available online for free. So I would look in there or go ask around on the internet. I planted iris bulbs from a friend's garden last year and got leaves. How and why do I replant them higher? As soon as you can work the soil, I would replant them higher. However, it could have been 2 things. If what you got was like the early spring iris, I think Siberica, it might not be a height problem. It might have been that they were overcrowded in her place, so they didn't build up enough energy to make flowers. If it's more the summer blooming iris that has that rhizome running on the surface of the ground, then it very well may be a depth issue. But you can replant them higher as soon as you can. Any tips for dividing rhubarb? I think rhubarb is one of those plants where you can hack it in half, but I would go online and double check that. You're welcome. Back to saving seeds. If you grow more than 1 variety of beans or peppers or tomatoes in the garden, will they cross so you don't get the same variety from the seed? So there's 2 things that you need to focus on if you're saving seeds. Thing 1 is whether the plant is open pollinated or hybrid. If the plant is labeled if it's labeled open pollinated, if it's labeled heirloom, then it is open pollinated. If it says hybrid or F1, then it's not. And the point with hybrids is they never breed true. It doesn't matter who they mate with, they do not breed true. Open pollinated means inbred to a point where they breed true. So for people who wrestle with that, I start talking about dogs. A Cocker Spaniel is an open pollinated dog. You breed 2 Cocker Spaniels, you get a Cocker Spaniel. Poodles are open pollinated dogs. You breed 2 of them, you get a poodle. If you breed a poodle and a Cocker Spaniel, you get an F1 hybrid. It's extremely predictable and it's called a cockapoo. If you breed a cockapoo with anything else, what you get is a mutt. The same thing holds true with plants. F1 hybrids don't breed true. You have no idea what you're going to get. The second thing is, where did the pollen come from? If the pollen comes from the same cultivar and it's open pollinated, it will breed true. With beans and peppers and tomatoes, that's likely. With squash, it's extremely unlikely. So there are tables that talk about what the safe separation is for various plants if you want them to breed true. For beans, I think they say 10 or 20 feet. For squash, they say half a mile. You can force it by either growing parthenocarpic plants. No, actually, that won't do it. Parthenocarpic plants will grow a fruit without having been pollinated. However, if they're pollinated, the seeds are going to be a genetic mix. They can be pollinated, they just don't have to be. So pretty much the way to be sure is to either grow plants that are where you're only growing one cultivar, or to make sure they're not growing anywhere near each other in the garden, or pick a couple of flowers where you are going to save the seed from. This even works with squash. Prevent pollinators from going to them and do the pollination yourself. So you can tie a squash flower closed before it ever really opens. Go get pollen from a male flower on the same plant, or at least the same cultivar. Open the female, wipe the pollen on 2 or 3 times, close it up again, and now you know who dad was, and it's going to breed through if it's open pollinated. Thoughts on winter sowing? In my reading, some winter sown tomatoes and pepper plants. Why does this work when germination needs warmth? Because you are making tiny little greenhouses. So germination doesn't require warmth, but it sure helps. It's going to germinate faster. So what happens in nature is the seed falls on the ground in fall, and some percentage get eaten, and some percentage rot, and some percentage germinate. When we sow a packet of seeds, we want 100% to germinate. And the faster that germination happens, the less likely it is that something goes horribly wrong on the way. That's why we add heat. It just makes things faster. Sowing tomatoes in winter sowing doesn't surprise me a whole lot, because I have seen tomato seedlings come up spontaneously. So the seed is viable up here. I have never seen volunteer peppers. Moreover, the literature says peppers will not reliably germinate until the soil temperature is about 60. So it's not clear to me that literally winter sowing peppers is going to work. However, what you could do is long about March, you could plant your peppers outside, your pepper seeds outside in under a cloche or a milk jug or whatever, and rely on the sun beating on that enclosure, warming up the soil and the air enough for the peppers to grow. But I'd be astonished if you could plant peppers in December that way. I have been astonished before. How do you get peonies to flower? The first thing you do is do a soil test. That's actually the first thing I tell almost anybody to do. You go do a soil test from a land-grant university, such as University of Massachusetts. Now, if everything else in your yard is growing just great, that's probably not the problem, but not a terrible idea anyway. The second thing is peonies are one of those plants that hate being transplanted. So if you just planted them last year or even the year before, it wouldn't surprise me if they're not blooming. And then the third thing is if they're planted too deep, they don't bloom. So if the peony has been where it is now for at least 3 years and it's not blooming, then I would dig it up and plant it higher. If it used to bloom and doesn't bloom now, then I would go for the soil test. And if you just planted it last year, I would wait. You also need to check how much sun you have. One of the marvelous things about New England is that we plant something in full sun, And 20 years later, that spot is now full shade. And somehow we don't notice that transition because we're just gardening. So that's the other thing to look at. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hellebores. So with all plants, what I would do is, the first thing is I would do is Google hellebore rhizomatic and see if they say anything useful. The second thing I would do is, unless they say anything, I mean, when you think about all of the stuff we've talked about dividing, with every last one of them, it's the same thing. You dig it up, you figure out a nice division point between the different growing points, and you break the plant there. So that's going to be the same thing with the hellebore. With the hellebore, since they bloom so early, I would probably divide it shortly after they finish blooming, not when the whole display is gone, because that might be late summer. Early, beginning of September might be okay too, if you can reliably find to plant them. You're very welcome, all of you. I sent the Garden Club Federation these slides and said, feel free to share them as you see fit. I don't know what they're going to do, but we'll find out.
Well, Gretel, we actually are recording this session, so we're
Yep.
going to be able to post this on our website very
Perfect.
soon. We'll just have to edit the little bit at the beginning when we had a glitch with you had to go off and then it come back on. But I
Right.
will probably also try to record a little introduction and then we'll put it together because everybody missed the introduction.
What I've found with a lot of these, I listen to great lectures on tape, and the first whole lecture is the guy reading all the qualifications of this speaker, and I
Right.
find I don't care.
Oh,
Just start telling me the
yeah.
topic. So I wouldn't worry too much about the introduction.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen, please? Because I
I
think
will
the
stop sharing
reception's a
my
little bit better.
screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, there you are, full color, full bloom. All right, awesome sharing this recording with family and friends. Yeah. So if anybody else doesn't have any other questions, they're all pretty much on mute. I think we can bid you adieu. I
Okay.
want to thank you very, very much. This was a very long presentation, much more than I expected,
Oh,
but
sorry about that.
incredibly informative, incredibly
Thank you.
informative. We had many, many people that we could not admit. The registration was about 90 plus, and there had to be at least 20 names that came in afterwards. After 100,
Oh,
we were maxed at 100. They had to register for this. So I think a lot of people tried to jump in tonight, and without the registration, we couldn't accommodate them. So at least the video was available for them.
okay.
All right. Thank you,
Peter,
Gretel. I know you do speak on some other topics. If you want to take a minute to let others know in case they would love to book you for their garden club, you're welcome to mention the different types of things that you also give speeches on. Would you like
so
to do that?
sure, you can book me either through the Massachusetts Master Gardener Association or the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. I speak about botany, GMOs, the history of plants and people, seeds starting, saving, and selecting, soils, vegetables, pretty much any plant topic. If I'm interested, I either have a lecture or would be happy to develop one. I don't do houseplants, but I'm game for almost anything else. And Peter,
Nice.
that's an awesome cat.
Well, I appreciate it. And thank you very much for everybody that hung in there. We had a great response tonight. So I'm thrilled that we were able to offer this to our members. And I appreciate your time as well. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'll see you, I hope, again somewhere around the circuit of garden clubs. Okay.
That would be wonderful. Good
Thank you
night,
very
everybody.
much. All right. Good night. Thank you all for coming.